But today's speakers are Max Lawson and Amitabh Behar. Max Lawson is the head of Inequality Policy for Oxfam International. He was previously head of policy and campaigns at Oxfam Great Britain and has helped author some of Oxfam's most high-profile papers. He also worked for Oxfam as governance advisor for many years, working in over 25 countries on budgets, governance, and public spending. He moved to Nairobi in January, along with Oxfam International's whole headquarters. Amitabh Behar is the Chief Executive Officer of Oxfam India and a global civil society leader and an authority on tackling economic and gender inequality and building citizen participation. Mr. Behar currently serves as the Vice Chair of the Board of Civicus, a global alliance of civil society organizations and activists dedicated to strengthening citizen action in civil society across the globe. Prior to Oxfam, Mr. Behar was the Executive Director of the National Foundation for India and served as the convener of National Social Watch Coalition and the co-chair of Global Call to Action Against Poverty, a network of over 11,000 civil society organizations. And before we get to their presentation themselves, they asked me to share a short video of showcasing Oxfam's activities, and I'll share that with you, and then we will all...
In an urban slum in Patna, 32-year-old Pratima Devi grieves for her twins. Pratima lost her twins in October 2018 due to lack of access to good public healthcare services. Her daughter was stillborn. Her son, born with extremely low birth weight, survived for only 9 days. Her husband Ranjit works as a driver and earns 8,000 rupees a month.
जैसे बच्चा हुआ बड़ी कम 1 किलो 100 ग्राम का पहले बउआ हुआ फिर उसको बाद फिर बच्ची मरा हुआ पैदा लिया तो वो घड़ी मैडम नहीं देखता तो वो घड़ी तो हमको बच्चा नहीं मरता पेट में लगता है रात ही के डेट कर गया.
Delivery took place at the government's primary health center at Fulwari Sharif. The couple was asked to take their baby boy to a private center with an incubator, but were not provided an ambulance. It took them 4 hours to locate a private hospital with an incubator that would admit their baby. To pay for the treatment, they were forced to borrow 50,000 rupees from moneylenders. 4 days later, seeing no improvement in the child, the private hospital discharged their baby. They took the child to a government tertiary hospital. After 5 days, the baby died.
कर्जा में तो बिका हुआ हम सगरों कर्जा भर रहे हैं जाने वाला चल गया कर्जा भर रहे.
23-year-old Chatya, a resident of the same slum, also paid the price of an underfunded government health facility. Married to a daily wage laborer, Chatya delivered her 4th child at the Fulwari Sharif Primary Health Center 6 months ago. Like Pratima, she was unable to avail of the free government ambulance service. When her baby did not cry at birth, Chatya found that the primary health center was not equipped to provide neonatal care.
वो बोलता है कि जो बच्चा सीरियस है जो लेके अलग जहाँ आपको सुविधा बुझाता है जहाँ लेके जाओ.
The parents took the baby to a private clinic where they were asked to pay 5,000 rupees before the baby could be admitted.
तो जाके इलाज करे लगा तो बच्चा फिर वहाँ से ठीक हो गया. उस समय नामों नहीं काटते थे. मैडम कहा रहा कि नहीं आज भर आओ रहने पड़ेगा. इसको दादी बोलने कि जे हम गरीब आदमी हैं हमको पैसा जुटवे नहीं करेगा तो हमारा बच्चा ठीक है हमको नाम काट दीजिए हम जा रहे हैं.
While Chatya's child survived, she is still paying back her debt. Ironically, while India attracts a large number of foreign patients for medical tourism, India spends only 3 rupees a day per person on public health. A look at the data shows that India's combined revenue plus capital spending for public health, water supply and sanitation together is less than the wealth of India's richest man.
I would say that in due course of time, we should be spending more on health in terms of GDP, more so in public health, and we should be able to reduce the out-of-pocket expenditure, especially for the poor people.
While half of India fights poverty, last year 18 Indians became billionaires. The wealth of the richest 1% in India increased by 39%, and the bottom 50% saw only a 3% increase. This widening gap between the rich and the poor can be filled. Along with other measures, If India increased tax on the richest 1% by just 0.5%, it could increase its spending on health by 50%. Pratima and Chatya's children could have been saved if only public services were not neglected and the richest paid their fair share of taxes.
I'll let Max Lawson do a presentation. If you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A and we'll address them after both Max Lawson and Amitabh Behar have made their presentations.
Great, can you hear me okay? Perfect. And can you see my screen? Okay, brilliant. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to speak. My name is Max Lawson. I have worked for Oxfam for a long time, as was introduced, and I worked on our recent report that we published in January, which was called the Inequality Virus, which is looking at the relationship between the coronavirus pandemic and growing levels of inequality. So I didn't prepare this presentation, so some of the slides I'm just going to flick through. But let me talk about the first. It's in three parts. The first part is looking at the gap between rich and poor. And I think that the first thing to note is a very, very rapid recovery for the richest people on Earth. At the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, nearly a year ago now, you saw a big stock market collapse. And that meant that the billionaires' fortunes fell dramatically, along with the incomes of hundreds of millions of people around the world, people thrown out of work, people losing their jobs, particularly women. So hardship across the globe. But then it was a very different story in terms of the recovery. So we calculated that looking at the 1,000 richest people on Earth, that by November of last year, their fortunes had recovered to where they were when the crisis hit. So it took about 8 or 9 months. And for some of them, like the really famous ones like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, in fact, and including Mukesh Ambani, you saw a dramatic increase, in fact, in their wealth. They were richer than they were when coronavirus hit. And collectively, the 10 richest people on Earth have seen their wealth increase by $540 billion. Now, that $540 billion, to put it in perspective, we worked out, in fact, this is a funny story. There is a man in America who decided he was going to count to 1 million for charity. And it took him 69 days of counting 16 hours a day to get to 1 million. If you tried to do that for 1 billion, say you were counting $1 billion, it would take you 244 years just to count to 1 billion. So to give you some idea of the scale of the money that we're talking, for 10 men, 10 individuals, to have $540 billion extra than from when the coronavirus pandemic began. And that would be more than enough, according to the calculations from the World Health Organization, more than enough to provide a free vaccine for every single person on the planet that needs it. So just give you some contrast with what's possible. And it would also be more than enough to reimburse the lost income of everyone on Earth who has been forced into poverty by the pandemic. So it's too early statistically to know for sure the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on inequality levels, on the gap between rich and poor. But all of the leading agencies, the World Bank, the IMF, the OECD, many others, all believe that it's likely that inequality will increase. And in producing this report, we did a survey of 295 economists from 79 countries, asking them whether they thought inequality was going to increase as a result of the pandemic. And you can see that 87% of respondents from virtually every country. I think every country but two, Denmark and Slovenia, every single country economists thought that inequality was going to increase in the coming years because of coronavirus. And this is partly because the incomes of the poorest have fallen dramatically, but also because the incomes of the richest, and not just the billionaires, but also more or less the top 10% of society, have not done as badly. Some of them have lost money, but they haven't lost money anything like as badly as the poorest. So you're seeing this growing gap. And we think, looking back at history, this is probably, we can't say for sure, but the first time since records began over a century ago that we would have seen inequality increase in virtually every country on earth at the same time. We also looked at other kind of intersecting inequalities related to the gap between rich and poor. And I think it's well documented now in a number of studies and in the literature that the impact of the coronavirus pandemic economically has been significantly harder on women, largely because they predominate in service sectors of the economy, in lower paid jobs, in informal jobs, and jobs without job security and employment rights. So we calculated that if women and men were equally represented in those kinds of sectors of the economy, because of historical injustice, women are overrepresented in these kinds of jobs. If they were equally represented, then 112 million fewer women would be at risk of losing their job because of COVID-19. We also drew attention to the future. So we looked at, together with the World Bank, a key message from the report is that although we think that inequality is going to increase because of coronavirus, that the choices that governments make in the next 2 or 3 years will dictate the next decade. And that's what we saw after the financial crisis, when the wrong choices were made and inequality continued to increase and was perpetuated. So here in this graph, you can see 3 scenarios put together by the World Bank from the number of people worldwide living on less than $5.50 a day. And the top one is where you see inequality increasing by 2 percentage points. And like I said, on current trends, this seems quite plausible and quite likely. And that means that from its level in 2020, where you had about 3.3 billion people worldwide living on less than $5.50 a day, that you would have a very similar level in 2030. So to put it in context, the fortunes of the world's billionaires have taken 8 months to recover. The fortunes of the world's poor, unless something is done dramatically to tackle inequality, will take over 10 years to recover the same level that they were when the virus hit. But conversely, and more positively, if governments took concrete steps to reduce inequality by 2 percentage points, as you can see with the bottom line, then this scenario where the poorest, the levels of poverty remain the same, doesn't need to happen. With concrete choices and the right choices, just as we saw in the video, the kinds of sensible choices around taxation and spending and support for the poorest, then you could see a continued reduction in the number of people living in poverty. So there really is a choice to be made. We also looked this year for the first time at inequalities of race as well. So I say race, but race, ethnicity, caste, I mean, it was very different depending on the context. That's one of the things we discovered, and the way that statistics are collected is very different, and the definitions are very different. In some countries like France, actually refuse to collect any statistics on ethnicity. Obviously in India, there's a long history of kind of caste distinctions and descriptions, so it's very different from country to country. But where you saw a systematic pattern is that in countries where racial discrimination was a serious issue, you saw significantly higher death rates for people from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds. And there's just two examples there. We couldn't do global numbers because the story is different in every nation. But for Brazil, because the mortality rate for those of Afro descent, of which is about 50% of Brazilians, just as of June, so just a few months into the pandemic, nearly 10,000 people of Afro descent would still be alive if they had been dying at the same rate as white Brazilians, and the same in the US. So again, Black people dying twice as much, sometimes 3 times more in some states than white people from COVID-19, and very high death rates among Latin descendants too. Again, so if the death rate was the same for white people in the US as it was for Black people, then up to 22,000 people, Black and Latinx people, would still be alive today. So just to illustrate the racist nature of this virus, it's an inequality virus that is feeding off existing inequalities, and it's almost it's laid bare a kind of topography of inequality that was already there. Then it's fueled those inequalities in the short term, and then it's contributing to a growing level of inequality in the long term unless we take action. So we looked at other inequalities mapped on to this expansion in the gap between rich and poor. I mean, we've looked at health, we looked at education. Some of the statistics around education are dramatic. Even here, I'm now in London in the UK, and my children attend a school just up the road, and a number of the children are from very poor backgrounds. And even here in London, because it's an inner city area, many of these children do not have access to the internet, or very little access, so they can't engage in online teaching. You can see in my child's class I was teaching this afternoon, homeschooling, quite regularly half of his class is not in class because they can't access. So you can see in very real time, even in the richest countries, the poorest children, particularly girls, falling behind and losing millions and millions of years of collective schooling, and the impact that has is heartbreaking to see all over the world. We've seen this enormous impact on livelihoods, and the gap in provision. You saw rich nations rush to support their people. You saw countries like Denmark supporting up to 85% of people's wages if they were made unemployed, and that has had an impact. The impact on inequality in Denmark of the virus will be significantly less because the government has moved fast to support people. In developing countries, that broadly didn't happen, with some notable exceptions. So again, it's not just the case that only rich countries can afford this. A country like Bolivia has increased its taxation of the richest, and particularly extractive industries like gas mining, and has used that to provide universal social benefits to all Bolivians. So in Togo, which is one of the poorest countries in Africa, they provided benefits for all informal workers who lost their jobs because of COVID-19. So we have seen some very positive stories around the world, but the main story is one of governments leading people to fend for themselves. And again, the impact on women in particular, and the burden of unpaid care is enormous. So the final section, and then I'll finish, is what's possible. At the same time, moments of crisis throughout history are moments of change, and we're still many years from seeing the being able to make an assessment of the impact of the coronavirus crisis, which is still going on as we speak. But we can be sure that it will have profound impacts across so much of our lives. And we also think within it, there's many politicians saying they want to get back to normal. I think Oxfam would be very clear that what we had before the coronavirus crisis, it would be very, very sad if we just ended up back there again, because it was a brutally unequal world before coronavirus hit. It was one where billionaires had huge fortunes and had seen their fortunes double since the financial crisis. It was one where hundreds of millions of people could barely survive one day to the next. So the key message of the report to finish this presentation is that we can build a much better world that we can look to a more positive future, and we can use the learnings from this crisis, particularly from the most positive experience, to build a new system that is fairer and more equal. And I remind you of that graph a few slides ago that showed the clear choice that governments have and the impact that would have on so many people's lives if they chose to reduce inequality. So we have a manifesto for what could be done. But the key point is that this is an inequality virus. So we need to see a profound and systematic attempt by every government on earth to reduce the gap between rich and poor, between women and men, between black people and white people. And by doing that, you have such a profound impact on well-being, on economic growth, in fact, as the IMF has said. You know, you have much more sustainable and resilient economy. And that can be based around caring for others. So basically looking at taking in the huge amount of unpaid care done in the economy and starting to count that within our economic calculations and reward it, and to have much more respect for labour rights, to pay more tax, as we saw in the video. You know, it's quite exciting that Argentina just 2 weeks ago has passed a one-off wealth tax to pay for the cost of the crisis. Such wealth taxes and other taxes are being discussed in many countries around the world. What we were desperate to avoid is the same situation we had after the financial crisis, where many countries that have already been very hard hit have to implement austerity measures, often under the tutelage of the IMF, and they have to cut taxes on the richest, cut spending even further. That would be a disaster. It would consign us to another decade of misery. Instead, this time around, it needs to be different. We need to make sure that the richest people on earth pay their fair share of tax. And by a fair share, what we mean is tax levels that were common just 20 years ago. It's hard to exaggerate the cuts that we've seen in the rates of tax on the richest people. We have a situation where a billionaire, someone like Warren Buffett, who's I think the third richest man on earth, every year he checks to see whether his percentage tax rate is higher than that of the secretary in his office. And every year for the last 10 years, he has discovered that he is paying a lower rate of tax than his secretary. So because of tax avoidance, tax evasion, a kind of religion of tax cuts, we now have a situation which is upside down, where the poorest workers are paying higher rates of tax than the rich. So no one, least of all Oxfam, is suggesting punitive taxes on the rich. We're talking about fair taxes on wealthy corporations and individuals. And that money would raise enough money to pay for the public services we saw in the video, to pay for a more equal world. And then finally, linking this crisis to the other crisis of climate change, and taking the learning from this crisis and the both good and bad, the ability of countries to react in a massive way in the face of an emergency and to repurpose their economies to build a greener future. And again, we see some positive signs of that, particularly from the Biden administration and the money that the European Union is ploughing into rebuilding their economies. We need to see much more of that in the developing world too. And we need to see far greater generosity. And step one, I mean, moving on from this presentation and to finish, is that we have to win the fight in the next 2 or 3 months for a people's vaccine, because underlying all of this recovery is unless we break through the system of vaccine apartheid that we're seeing in the world today, where here in the UK, the government has hoarded enough vaccines to vaccinate every citizen 5 times over, and yet most developing countries would be lucky to vaccinate 1 in 10 citizens in 2021. That's criminal, and we need to break through that vaccine apartheid. We need to mass produce vaccines. We need to face down the pharmaceutical industry and have open source vaccines for the world. So I'll finish on that, because we've been fighting for that since the paper was published. And I think it's perhaps the most profound inequality that we can all see in the newspapers today. So that's a summary of the paper. I hope I didn't go on over my time, but yes, so just huge increase in the gap between rich and poor because of COVID-19. the implications not just on economic inequality, but on race, on gender, and all these other aspects of educational and health inequalities. And then finally, the ingredients within all this to build a fairer future for us and for our children. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Max. And now we'll move on to Amitabh Behar presentation. And if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A.
So thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Max, for introducing our report. Daniel, it's a great pleasure to be here. And as Oxfam India, we are really delighted to build this partnership. And hopefully we'll see many stimulating conversations in the next few weeks and months. So let me start with a personal experience, and Max has given us a fairly big picture of what's happening around inequality. But let me give you an experience. A few years ago, I was in Marathwada, that's central Maharashtra, and that's a region which sees a drought pretty much every year. And I was essentially there doing some drought relief work. It was a very, very tough day. I saw livestock dying, women actually walking kilometers to get water, and they were obviously carrying water on their head, just drinking water back to their families. After this tough day of doing whatever relief work we were doing, I went back to Pune, and from Pune I was driving to Mumbai. And a very famous journalist in India, many of you would know him, P. Sainath, called me when I was in Pune. And he said, when you're going to Mumbai, please don't sleep. Ensure that you're looking at the billboards, the advertising that's happening on the highway. And I did do that. And let me say that it was one of those really devastating moments. Coming from this drought hit area, very, very heart-wrenching scenes that I had seen. And what we saw, the billboards that I saw were essentially advertisements. Every 5 kilometers, there would be a massive billboard advertising an apartment which had a swimming pool for each flat. Every flat had a swimming pool, and Mumbai is the capital of this region that I'm talking of. So that's the level of water inequality or access to resources inequality that we see. And when I reached Mumbai, I was going to the airport. This is something I never forget. And then you end up, people who've been in Mumbai, they must be traveling from the Mumbai airport to the city. And then you come across this massive structure, 30-floor structure, which was one of the most expensive. At one point of time, it was the most expensive residence, and which housed only 4 people, around 30 floors. And just in 2 or 3 kilometers vicinity of that building, there live probably thousands of people, hundreds of thousands actually live without access to even drinking water or sanitation. And sadly, that the structure, I don't know how many of you have seen the picture, which Mukesh Ambani owns, it's his residence, is even architecturally not beautiful. I find it quite ugly. So, that's again, in a city, you see the level of inequality. Let me just quote another figure from 2 years ago, and then I'll talk about this year's report a little. 2 years ago, our report said that in India, we had 9 richest people who had more wealth than the bottom 50% of this country. And just to remind the audience here, I don't know how many of you are from South Asian studies, but India is now 1.3 billion people. So essentially, we were looking at 2 years ago, 9 people had more wealth than almost 650 million people. That's the level of inequality we are looking at. So this year's report, Max talked of the global scenario. In India, let me just again, because I talked of Mukesh Ambani. Mukesh Ambani this year during the pandemic was literally earning 900 million rupees per hour. Let me just repeat, 900 million rupees per hour. And this is the time when 24% of the Indian population was living with 3,000 rupees a month. So again, just to help you look at the picture, the top 11 billionaires added so much to their wealth that they could have sustained the Indian Ministry of Health for 10 years. That's the level billionaires made during the pandemic. On the other hand, most of the people in India, we saw those heart-wrenching pictures of the migrant crisis, the people working in the informal sector, in metros, not having access to food, to shelter, having no access to the highways, just walking back to their hometowns, to their villages, just in search of basic food and shelter. And this was the stark inequality we're looking at. But in India, and Max has quite eloquently talked about the dimensions of inequality. And I think it would be very critical for us to recognize the multiple dimensions of inequality that we look at. So let me just give you one more figure. And Amartya Sen actually talks about the missing millions in this country. So if you look at the gender sex ratio at birth for the 0 to 6 age group, doctors say if nature has its own way, you'll have 1,000 boys for 1,000 girls. But in India, you have only 916 girls for 1,000 boys. So what you're looking at, almost 84 girls missing for every 1,000. And that's what Amartya Sen says are the missing million. These girls are not being allowed to be born. This is about patriarchy. This is about sex-selective abortion. And the inequality then resurfaces in multiple forms. So double discrimination around if you're a Muslim, then the socioeconomic indicators are way worse. And similarly for backward castes, particularly the Dalits, Adivasis, which are the tribals in this country, there's almost a 30+ point difference between literacy rate for Adivasi women, the tribal women, and the general population. So inequality is getting reflected in multiple ways. I think we need to understand that this is happening in a particular political context. We need to be clear that inequality is not inevitable. And we've seen that. It is clearly a policy choice. We are making a political choice by agreeing to live with these levels of inequality. So what is, I just wanted to spend now a few minutes on looking at what is Oxfam doing to address the levels of inequality we see in this country. One of the big things that we are doing is to work on the public narrative. And that we do through multiple ways. And now I'm focused on the work that Oxfam India does. So this is building a public narrative around questions of inequality. As I personally believe that it's one of the most important moral questions of our times. But very often inequality is seen as part of an accepted system. So we are doing it through our reports, like the report that Max talked of, which came up with a Global Inequality Report, but we also have the India supplement. In addition to that, we also do another inequality report, which would be out in a couple of months. We're also now taking the discourse beyond the national level. And for instance, last year, before the Bihar elections, we were able to come up with the Bihar Inequality Report. So one of the big things is to constantly talk about inequality. And it's interesting. This year, after we released our report, pretty much all political parties have actually used our report to highlight the problems with the kind of crony capitalism we have and the market fundamentalism that we see. So, and it's pretty much across the board that we are seeing that a discourse is getting certainly built. The second, our long-lasting work is on looking at essential public services. And as Max was saying, and our brief film also talked about it, one of the drivers of equality is high quality public education and public health system. So we've been working on that at absolutely the local level. Just let me give you one more interesting but disturbing statistics. You saw those pictures of the contrast in the public health system and the private elite health tourism that India offers to the international people. In India, the investments in the public health system is fourth from the bottom globally. That's the level of low levels of investment we have. We have only around 1.5% of the GDP being invested in the public health system, whereas successive governments for the last 30 years have been promising around 3%, but we've never seen actual real investments being made. Even this year, our finance minister constantly said that investing in health is going to be a big thing, but if you break down the budget numbers, you'll realize that there's no real enhancement of public health investments. And this is in the year where we've clearly seen that it is the public health system which was there for the poor and the marginalized of this country during COVID. So the second big chunk of our work in terms of fighting inequality is to invest in education and health. And we are doing that through a bottom-up process of building demand through community groups, through school management committees, parent-teacher associations. So it's really a bottom-up building of the need for public health and public education system. The third is, this is a new piece of work, and I'm glad that you would be doing a conversation on this in a few weeks from now. We're going to be working a lot now on the informal sector worker. In India, and this came out so strongly during COVID, in India, we have almost 92% of the workforce in the informal sector. And they do not have job security, they do not have social security. So they're living in an extremely difficult condition. We do work with the sugar industry, we work in the tea industry, and we'll share the details later, hopefully in the next conversation around that. But our work is now essentially looking at what Max talked of, that we must shift the discourse from minimum wages, which are essentially linked to the poverty line, to looking at living wages, which is needed to ensure a life of dignity. So that's the third piece. The fourth and an interesting piece is also we are trying to look at questions of economic justice and questions of climate justice. And we are looking at it from the lens of the Adivasis and how in the climate crisis, they're losing out their access and control over natural resources. So we are working on the basic forest rights of the Adivasi, the tribal communities, and we work both on their individual rights as well as the community rights over the forest resources. And in all this, then we also, one of the underlying things is to look at questions of patriarchy. I did talk of patriarchy as one of the fundamental markers of inequality. And on patriarchy, one of the major initiatives that we have is on violence against women. And we are working at multiple levels in terms of countering violence against women, including, again, building a public discourse against that. So in all this, Oxfam India is trying to work with a theory of change where we believe that it is the bottom-up pressure of communities getting mobilized and seeking their rights, demanding their rights from the government. And so that's one major part of our work. The second part is, how do we then build a broader rainbow alliance of middle classes, of youth groups, of women's group, who are then enabling and supporting the bottom-up demand building that happens. I think, it's critical, as Max said, for us to really reboot post-COVID our economies in a way that they're more green, they're more feminist, and where people are at the center. And what is really critical, as in these might be small countries, but just look at the New Zealand example. It's saying that we don't need a growth budget, we need a well-being budget. Much closer home for me, you have Bhutan, which for the last several years has been talking of the happiness index. So it is time that this one of the biggest moral questions of our times, this obscene inequality ends, and we make our contributions in ending that. Thank you.
Thank you, Amitabh, for that presentation, and to Max for your searing discussion of inequality in the world today, as well as the work that Oxfam has been doing. I encourage people to submit their questions in the Q&A. We already have a few. I'll be reading them out. One of the first questions, I'm actually going to pair two of them together, from Simarjeet Rao asks, what are the valid solutions? And Aishwarya Pradeep adds, I acknowledge this is a hard question to answer, but can continuing capitalism help solve inequality? Curious your thoughts on either of those.
Amitabh, do you want to go?
Max, why don't you go first?
Okay, sure. So I think the really positive thing, because often these reports can feel a bit depressing and you think, oh, the world is in terminal decline. And one of the other reports that we produce looks at, it's an index of over 160 countries, and it looks at concrete practical things countries are doing to reduce inequality. And the really positive news is that countries at all levels of income, even the poorest countries in the world, have it within their power to do the right thing and to reduce the gap between rich and poor. And that to answer the other question, that doesn't require an overthrow of the capitalist system. It requires a fairer capitalist system. It requires the kind of system that you see in social democracies in parts of Europe, ones where, but even that you saw in recent history. People often ask us a quiz, which country on earth had the highest effective rate of tax on the richest in history? And it was the United States that had a top rate of 93% on the richest 5% of Americans for 30 years, through the most successful years in US history in terms of economic growth. So I think it's a key argument that we want to make, that this isn't about overthrowing this entire system. It is about rebuilding it dramatically and doing it in fairer ways. But there are concrete, practical steps. And I think the universal basic income is a good example of that, where you really can make a massive difference. And you did see some countries do dramatic things to, I think in Bangladesh, they increased the number of people getting cash benefits because of coronavirus by tens of millions of people in the space of a month. Dramatic things can be done. So I always think it's good to hear those positive stories as well as the negative ones.
So Daniel, if I just add quickly to, if the first question I understood right was also about the solutions. So we did talk about the solutions. So just to restate them, fair share of taxes, investing in public services like education and health, rebooting the economy in a more green and people-centered sectors. So these are some of those ways of addressing it. And certainly, I think the big question is, this is really not about overthrowing of the capitalist system. You know, it's a fundamental question of distribution. And there are different ways of looking at the capitalist system. And these are unacceptable levels of inequality. So, you know, last year I was at the World Economic Forum, the mecca of obviously the billionaires and the super rich. But it was interesting to hear them, because in conversations after conversations, I heard this phrase, which I thought was interesting, that even WEF and these super rich were saying that it is a time for us to move from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. So if there is this recognition, I think it's critical. The survey that we did and Max talked of, 270 or 290 of the top economists saying that we are going to be looking at higher levels of inequality. And then IMF saying that it would lead to tremendous social and political upheaval. So therefore, it's not about really looking at an overthrow of a system. It is really at least realigning the system around a fairer distribution. So that's really fundamental for us.
On that lines, Max had mentioned a UBI, and I had a question from Andrew Riedel, who said, what are your opinions on a UBI funded through taxes on high income wealth and carbon tax? And I'll add to that, are there any cases, countries where you thought the universal basic income has been more successful that can be models for India or other parts of South Asia?
I think, what do I think? I definitely think the universal, depends, I mean, obviously it's one of those elastic terms that means many, many things to many people. But have we seen a situation where more countries have moved to some form of universal benefit because of COVID-19? Absolutely. And have they proved that it's possible, even in some of the poorest countries in the world, like Bolivia? 96% of Bolivians are covered by some kind of transfer. It's totally possible. So whether you call that a universal basic income or a universal cash grant, a universal system of protection, it's a social contract whereby you're progressively taxing those with more wealth and more income, and you're distributing that to as many people as possible. We move away from these, we've had for 30 years, largely thanks to the World Bank, a focus on this kind of micro targeting of benefits, that it's going to go to the poorest of the poor. And, you know, that's just both politically and technically failed. You know, it means that many, many poor people get left out, is what happens, because it's impossible to decide who's poor and who isn't. And poverty is a dynamic thing. If we've learned one thing from this crisis, is that the majority of humanity are one paycheck away from poverty. You know, it's not the case the poor are over there somewhere and they're a problem to be dealt with. And I think the universality also brings in the collective nature of the politics. You know, people are very, very supportive of universal benefits because they see it as a society-wide thing to do. So I do hope that at least that word universal will become much more palatable in the coming years because of what we've seen in the last year. And hopefully, yes, we will see more countries introduce, as Spain has done, some kind of universal basic income, yes.
Has there been, Amitabh, any move for a universal basic income in India?
So, Daniel, so I saw your advertisement of your next conversation with Mr. Rahul Gandhi. So you certainly should ask him, because during the 2019 election, that was one of the primary planks for the campaigning for the Congress. And it's an important and interesting idea. Let me just, at the moment talk about the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which is obviously nowhere close to the universal basic income, but it's essentially about guaranteeing work by the government. What was fascinating to look at is the NREGA performance during COVID. The government kept saying that we have this stimulus package and another stimulus package. They kept saying that it's up to 10%, although if you break down the numbers, it's not really gone beyond 2%. But we've constantly seen a tremendous increase in the demand for NREGA. which was very clear that the Rural Employment Guarantee Act was essentially the scheme which gave sustenance to the poor and marginalized. And this is again a universal scheme. So I think it's critical for us to recognize, and as Max was saying, we've seen targeted schemes fail in India with the weak state capacities that we have. It has been extremely difficult to do the targeted schemes, and therefore it would be really important to look at a universal initiative, and universal basic income is something which is worth a very sincere and serious shot in India.
I just want to encourage anyone with a question, rather than raise your hand, please type it in the Q&A. But actually, I have a question. In your presentation about inequality in India, it reminded me a lot of what similar debates I've seen here in the United States. And I was just wondering if you could remark on what is unique about the inequality in India and what is similar to other places.
Okay, so I'll not be very confident in saying how it's similar to other places, but what I can certainly say is probably inequality, as in we're looking at the global data. It is not unique to only one country or another country. I think it is a much larger question of the neoliberal policies that we have adopted globally. So if you really look at, say, even Thomas Piketty picking the Indian data, it is saddening to see that now we are living in a more unequal world than what we were pre-independence. Whereas what is interesting to note is that post-1947, it's interesting, his research tells us post-1947 till 91, that's the moment of economic liberalization, we saw a constant decline in inequality. So it is really a much broader global moment. But the uniqueness of India, I would say, maybe, I should be cautious and not say that it's unique, but what I think are important features. One is the caste dimension. It is extremely pronounced in India. And the second is the complete capture, I would say, of the public discourse. And that's where I think academics are so important, where talking about inequality is critiqued by senior journalists, senior thinkers, saying that you are just trying to ensure that everybody becomes poor. And that's the critique we've got. There is a tremendous acceptance in Indian media, in the public discourse, about the current policies. And inequality is seen as something which is kind of inevitable in the growth trajectory we are taking. And that's something I think it's certainly a massive challenge for the work we do here. Maybe Max, you can talk of how is it different from other countries?
Sorry, in what sense, Amitabh? I didn't really get your point.
How inequality in India is similar to or different from how it's manifest in other places where Oxfam works.
I think that the Piketty stuff is fascinating because, that study from the Raj until the modern day. I mean, obviously the caste system is virtually unique. So the interaction and the kind of intersectionality between your economic inequality and caste inequality is just not replicated. I mean, there's similarities with race in Brazil and in South Africa, but the way it's kind of, in fact, Piketty's last book looks at this very well in India in terms of the impact of the quota system in some senses in tackling inequality, but in the absence of any real redistribution. So there's a kind of positives and negatives. I do think we are seeing a parallel all over the developing world, though. You are seeing an increase in inequality just about everywhere, and that was happening before COVID-19. You already have very high levels of inequality in post-colonial states, largely thanks to my ancestors, for which I apologize. But basically, you know, this legacy of land concentration is the same in Africa, it's the same in Latin America. But the interesting thing in the last 20, 30 years, if you've also seen even the most equal countries in Europe having big increases in inequality, and what we thought was an iron economic law that the richer you got, the more equal you become, is simply not proven to be the case. In fact, it's quite possible for rich countries to slip backwards and to become more and more unequal. Yeah.
Another question about redistribution. Since redistribution runs against politics that is captured by the elite, how do you propose to tackle that hurdle?
I think the politics of redistribution are fascinating, and if you want to feel optimistic, then you can look. There's a wonderful book called The Triumph of Injustice, which is about the history of progressive taxation in the United States. And I suppose the simple answer is it is political, and political is not set in stone. And there are, you know, the elites. We work with a wonderful group of very, very rich people in America called the patriotic millionaires, who are campaigning for higher taxes on the rich. And there are, I'd say elites are not uniform. And I think, you know, a strong understanding of politics and the way that politics plays out is can lead to significant progressive change, and certainly has done in history. So are we in very difficult political positions all over the world? Yes, we definitely are. I mean, I've just been living in Kenya, where, you know, the first move of the government when COVID-19 hit was to cut the top rate of that tax on the rich. It was probably the single worst thing they could have done. So I don't want to belittle the struggle we have politically, but I also think that history shows us that those struggles can be won, and that some elements of elites can see the benefits in greater progressive taxation for society and for their country as a whole. And that done in the right way, you can see progressive change happen. So I certainly don't think it's an impossibility, but it is a hard fight, and it's not something that happens technically. It happens politically, and it happens through people campaigning and fighting for progressive change. It's not a simple technical fix, that's for sure.
Amitabh, do you have anything to add? Or
so, you know, I think it's a fascinating question, and I would really say that you know, to maybe broaden the debate a little, the lack of ability of the current systems to address questions of redistribution is resulting in the authoritarian regimes that we are seeing, and that's happening across. So there is this you know, contradiction between the idea of democracy and inequality, which is pretty obvious. But unfortunately, the kind of representative democratic systems that we have evolved are actually leading to greater inequality. And so that's really one of the big challenges. You know, we are all engaged in our ways of looking at how does one fight the authoritarian populism, populist regimes that we're looking at. But I think till we start addressing the question of inequality as one of the central political questions, it's unlikely that we'll see the democratic upsurge that's needed. And as Max was saying, that ultimately it is going to be a popular struggle against inequality. I would actually say, as in, you know, on the one hand, you're looking at growing inequality. On the other, you're looking at the tremendous amount of authoritarian regimes. You do have a different regime now, but starting from, say, Trump to Erdogan to Modi to the Philippines, it's really across the world you're seeing the rise of these populist leaders. But on the other hand, what I just wanted to draw your attention to is that, if I remember correctly, last year, as in before COVID, we saw 30 mass struggles and mass uprisings across the country. So whether it was in Chile, whether it was in Beirut, and they were all essentially expressions of people's anger against the unequal systems that we have created, against inequality. So, to my mind, this is the central question moving ahead for democratic politics.
No, that's a very good point. And I'll add, as someone who does work in Sri Lanka, there was a democratic election to remove the authoritarian leading Rajapaksas in 2015, and then they get voted back in 2019. So, it's a very complex interaction between these forces.
Yes.
We have several other questions. Please type them in Q&A. Kirtana asks, how do we ensure the wealth flows from the upper strata to the lower, apart from increasing the tax of the rich, will be a society of upper and lower class and not eliminating the middle class forever? Because how do we ensure that there's some balance to the wealth flows from to everyone equitably?
Yeah, I think I can take that. And I think, again, there's a lot of variation between countries. But I think what you have seen is a stagnating of middle class incomes in the rich world, which is different to the developing world. So, those in the kind of middle of the income spectrum have seen their incomes pretty much stagnant for quite a long time. And the poorest have seen a much worse situation. I think in other countries, you've seen a story of certainly a growing middle class. I mean, it depends what you define as middle class. I mean, the World Bank's definition of middle class is $10 a day, which would not get you very far here in London, I can tell you. But still, nevertheless, one of the big success stories of the last 50 years is a growing, particularly in Asia, a growing group of people with a bit more money. And that's a very, very positive thing. But one of the things that we've shown is that the vast majority of the growth in income globally has still gone to the top 1%. So what we're saying is almost as much has gone to the top 1% in the last 40 years as has gone to the bottom 50% all put together. So the bottom half of humanity has got the same level of income as the top 1%. So we think that's wildly inefficient. If that was distributed more widely across the spectrum, that the middle class would still have rising incomes, they'd still have all the benefits that growth brings, but the poor would be better off too, and the rich would still be rich. They'd just be, Bill Gates would have $5 billion instead of $100 billion. There comes a point when there's, we did one statistic a few years ago. We worked out that if Bill Gates were to go shopping and spend $1 million a day, it would take him about 211 years to spend all of his money. He doesn't need that kind of fortune. So it's immensely inefficient, if you think, to put all that money in the hands of a tiny group. So yes, it would grow the middle class, but also the poor too. And you would still have rich people. You'd still have super yachts, but maybe not quite as big and maybe not quite so many.
Daniel, can I add? Should I? Yeah. Okay. So Daniel, what I would say is, Max has given us hard numbers, but just in terms of the conceptually, just going back to the basic human rights framework is also critical. In a country like India, 12 years ago, we had a government commission on the informal sector workers, but they came up with the findings that then 78% of the Indian population was living with less than 20 rupees a day, which then would have been half $1, 78% of the population. We've not had poverty estimates in this country for the last 10 years. But what we have is, say, the last estimate said around 23 to 24% living below the poverty line, which are very, very conservative estimates. And let me just say that in India, then we had not moved on to multidimensional poverty. It is essentially a hunger line that we're looking at. So this is really a hunger line, not a poverty estimate. So in this context, just ensuring the basic fundamental rights of access to education, access to shelter, access to health can fundamentally re-alter So sometimes I feel that it is the basic social contract that needs to be respected. And that is completely broken in a country like India, where you have the top 5%, 7% living in an extremely opulent life. They've almost seceded from the country. They've created their own mini islands, even within a city like Delhi, where they have private provisioning for everything, including security. And on the other hand, you have millions and hundreds and millions of people actually living without the basic minimum wages. So, just a rights framework, which is part of the Indian Constitution, could deliver the change that we're looking at. But that's also something that we've not been able to adequately work on.
That makes sense. We have a question. We're nearing the end. This is from Aishwarya Pradeep. Is there any global effort to redefine growth beyond GDP? Can that help streamline government goals more towards human development and redistribution of wealth and other resources?
That's an excellent question. We've definitely looked at that, and so has Piketty. And then there's a strong read across to obviously the movement for more sustainable, more green economies. Had a lot of dispute and debate. But I think, as Amitabh mentioned in his presentation, there is one interesting group of countries called the Wellbeing Alliance, who are starting to calculate a kind of definition around well-being, and I think New Zealand is one of the most prominent of those nations, and so is Costa Rica. So there's a lot of people out there talking about different levels of measurement, and I think certainly for Oxfam, our clear message is that we need to see concrete targeting to reduce the measurements of inequality, because you can have the same GDP growth in Angola or Vietnam, and all of the GDP growth in Angola will go to like one family, and everyone else is left in destitution, whereas in Vietnam it would be spread across society in a way that would benefit many. So I agree, GDP is completely impossible from an inequality point of view. It doesn't tell you anything. So absolutely, lots of ideas out there, but nothing has really kind of stuck yet, but some countries at least experimenting. Yeah.
So one more question is from Mandy Hoon, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. What are the significant benefits of adding more of a focus on climate or environmental changes? How does it directly or indirectly apply to the drastic wealth inequality?
I would put it the other way myself. I would say that if you don't do that, then you can have a real backlash. And we saw that in France, where President Macron introduced higher fuel taxes to pay for green interventions, whilst cutting the top rate of the wealth tax on the richest. And it fueled populism, and you had a dangerous situation where you had a lot of angry people on the street who were associating concrete steps to tackle climate change with elites, with all the wrong things, which was very sad. So unless we do make climate justice also about economic justice and fighting inequality together with fighting for a better planet, then you're just not going to get the kind of popular support for the kinds of dramatic changes to our economy that we need. So I'd say on the negative side, they have to be combined, or else they're never going to happen. But then on the positive side, as we put in the report, there are so many ways in which we can rebuild our economies in a greener way that is also a much fairer way, not least the correct recognition, calculation and redistribution of the huge amount of unpaid care work that's done by predominantly women all over the world, and recognizing that our economies, as coming to the last question, function in very, very different ways than the simplistic measures of GDP. So I do think it can be done in ways, and lots of very clever people thinking about it, that where you bring a greener future and a fairer future together. But I don't think it's automatic, and they can often, something like a carbon tax, for instance, or the blanket removal of fuel subsidies. As we know, in India, for instance, fuel subsidies on kerosene are very, very important for the poorest people, whereas perhaps fuel subsidies on petrol are much, much more targeted at the middle classes and those who own cars. So I think we just need to be really cautious when we're calling for green action, that we make sure it's also a fair action on inequality at the same time. Yeah.
Well, we are nearing the end of our time here. It is getting late in India. It's 10:45, and we could see that the night is coming to you, Max, as well.
Yeah, I had to switch the light on, yeah.
On behalf of the South Asia Program and the Mario Nadi Center for International Studies, I want to thank Amitabh Behar and Max Lawson for joining us today for this enlightening discussion. Thank also Ranjana Das and Reena Soni for helping put this together. We have another event with Oxfam on March 22nd about their work on tea plantation workers and gender rights in Assam. Please join us for that. And we have our conversation with Rahul Gandhi next Tuesday. We'll be emailing everyone information about that event. And otherwise, I want to thank you both for joining us. Thank you everyone for attending. And hopefully we'll see you at a future webinar on the screen coming near you.
Thank you. It was very kind.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.